Welcome to Architecture at the Auditorium, Exploring with the Experts. I'm Regan, CEO of the Auditorium Theatre. You're about to join an exclusive tour of Chicago's Auditorium Theatre with 4 of our experts. Each expert will explore a different element of the theater's architecture, focusing on light, the iconic arches, stained glass, and ornament. Moderating our first 3 episodes will be McNicholas, Chicago architect and Auditorium Theatre Board Member. I have the pleasure of joining Matt for the 4th episode, where we focus on ornament. The Auditorium Theatre is a National Historic Landmark known around the world for its perfect acoustics, pioneering architecture, and stunning design. In 1889, this Adler and Sullivan masterpiece opened to immense critical acclaim from all around the world. Today, it continues as a living and breathing performing arts space where we host dance, theater, music, and speakers. On this week's episode, Matt sits down with architectural historian and stained glass expert, Rolf Achilles, to talk about the incredible stained glass in our theater. Enjoy.
Welcome, Rolf. We're sitting here in the historic lobby of the Auditorium Building Hotel off of Michigan Avenue, and you're one of the world's foremost experts on art glass and stained glass, and we have a wealth of it in the building, so we wanted to have a chat with you about these gems we have here.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a real treat to be in this building anytime, and we're sitting right in front of one of the great windows that isn't its original location. It was a ceiling light, but this is an opportunity to actually see one of the great windows produced in Chicago by the Healy and Millay Company and an auditorium building designed by Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan. It's a great opportunity to talk about this significant glass and the impact that it had, not just in Chicago or the United States, but in the world.
Let's get into that, right? But maybe we start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about what the difference between, sort of your normal clear, regular glass is and stained glass?
Well, window glass is just clear glass, and stained glass has a stain in it, and the stain is an oxide. Different oxides will give you different colors of glass. They've done this for 1,000 years or 2,000 years, the different colors. But to roll it and make it flat and then ripple the glass and install it in windows, and it's a total mechanical process. That's something that the 19th century developed.
So you mentioned machine-made glass. Are we looking at machine-made designs as well in the theater here, or?
No, only the glass is machine-made. The designs are all hand-drawn. They were made as in cartoons on paper and then cut out into cardboard, and then the cardboard was used to cut out the glass as a pattern.
Template. Okay.
As a template. And what we see is in this window behind us here is an assemblage, and that's all handmade. It's hand-cut, machine-made glass. And the assortment, the selection of the glass, so that some is more lighter than others and darker, that's all handmade, and that's the eye of the person who's assembling the window.
So really kind of like the role of the artisan in making the glass sing.
It's very evident. The artisan is present.
So you mentioned a little bit about like who designed them. So Healy and Millay was the company, but Did Louis Sullivan, give them specifically designs for every window, or?
Well, he may have designed a few of these. There's so much design in the building that it's physically impossible for one person to have done it in the time that it took. So there must have been a number of people working in the manner of Sullivan, and that was a typical 19th century project, way of working, that a good craftsman can work like other good craftsmen. They didn't have the ego name recognition that we do today. So they looked at huge sheets of glass, 4 by 8 feet of glass, and the artisan cut out little pieces of that glass and arranged them in the pattern based on the cartoons.
Would they look at the textures or the striation in the glass?
You'll notice that the ripples in the glass don't contradict each other. They're all smooth together in a way that they cross the lead lines, and a line going this way is not going to run into a line going this way. And it was all a very conscious effort to make a uniform pattern. And that's what we see here. Yeah. The lens in the center of this piece, that orange circle, it's flat on one side and semi-round on the other.
Like a telescope.
Like a telescope lens. And then it's cut into facets. And those were specific companies. That wasn't made in Chicago. Okay. There were other companies that had water wheels and grinding wheels and Bohemian technicians that came from Bohemia that could make that kind of glass. It's very complicated.
So when we look at the faceted glass in these windows, that wasn't cast. That was all...
It's not cast. The cheap stuff is cast.
Okay.
But this isn't cheap. So it's hand cut and hand faceted. And it would take some time to hand facet because all the facets have to align up, which means you have to know, cutting a diamond, you have to know what you're doing, or cutting a gemstone. You have to know what you're doing. And these were specialists.
But we have other areas where we do have cast glass, right?
Oh yeah.
Nuggets and things like that.
Nuggets and chunks of glass. If they look like ice cubes, those are cast. They did not cut those. And if you come through the lobby and walk through the auditorium, do look at all the different varieties of glass.
One of the fun games I find in the theater is approach the glass from a different perspective and you can see how much three-dimensionality there is.
Oh yeah, you always want to look at it from the side too, because glass is three-dimensional. We always think of glass as being flat, like your window at home is flat. But this window has dimensionality to it. The ripples give it a shadow effect, and the window looks much deeper. Sure. And the idea is not to look through the window.
Right.
The idea is to look at the window,
right,
which is like a Van Gogh painting. It's not a completely flat surface. It has lots of little lines in it, ridges of paint based on the way the brush was held and the way the brush and the paint was applied. Right. Well, this is the way the roller made the glass and the ripples in the glass, and then how it was cut out.
How did specifically the glass of the theater here influence architectural design and interior design worldwide?
Well, it's an abstraction of glass. There's no patterns, there's no human figure, and there's no paint. The European glass at the same time, in the 1850s, since the glass windows were made, are always painted. You go to medieval cathedrals, there's painted windows. You go to 19th century German glass, they're painted. And that's a different technique. It may have depth and all that, but it's different. And the Americans come along and don't paint the glass. The color in the glass becomes the stained glass window color. The Europeans have color in the glass, but they paint on the glass. And it's the paint that we see. And that is used in the US in religious contexts continuously, even to this day. And in a secular context, such as the auditorium building, we see non-painted glass that's enormously decorative. It's the ripple in the glass, it's the color of the glass, and the way the glass has been fit together, cut, and the Europeans had never seen anything like this before the 1889 World's Fair in Paris.
What happened then?
Well, Chicago had a booth there, and in that booth they showed the auditorium plaster work and stained glass window and metal work. And the stained glass windows got written up. Nobody had ever seen patterned windows like this in Europe that weren't painted. They called them mosaic glass because it's much more like a floor mosaic. Sure. And so that was 1889. And they showed windows like the one right behind us here in that World's Fair exhibit. It's the Eiffel Tower World's Fair. They didn't win first prize, but they won second prize, which was the purchase prize. And immediately at the end of the fair, they went into the Decorative Arts Museum The whole Chicago show, auditorium show, went into the Decorative Arts Museum. And you just know that every architect, every designer, anybody that was interested in new things went to look at them. Contemporary hotshot artists like Hector Guimard, Victor Horta, Henry van de Velde, all these people that we now say are the influencers of and the inventors of Art Nouveau, they all went to look at what came out of Chicago.
Inspired by
the auditorium building.
Right.
So that we can easily make the transition, and it's not a quantum leap of any kind, that Art Nouveau really begins in Chicago, not in Paris, not in Brussels. And it was this show of works that were already in the auditorium building in 1888-89 that the Parisians saw.
Right.
And then that brought about, a couple of years later, an art dealer, a French art dealer named Bing. So Samuel Bing is commissioned by the French government to come to Chicago in 1893 to see what's happening here.
What's happening in 1893?
Well, the World's Fair, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And that introduces the Ferris wheel. But other than that, it also brings in lots of Europeans that come to Chicago, and they see the buildings in the downtown, come to the auditorium building, look at the stained glass window, they hear concerts here, they go into the Loop and they see new skyscrapers, they see the use of aluminum, and all these things are new to them. And Samuel Bing comes to Chicago at the request of the French government, as I mentioned. On the way, he stops in New York to talk to Tiffany, but in Chicago, he meets with Louis Sullivan and others about what's going on in the auditorium building. And that makes Sullivan a fulcrum for what happens in Europe. There's the old way of doing things, and then there's the new way of doing things. And Chicago with Sullivan is on the new way of doing things. And Bing goes back to France, writes his report, talks about Tiffany and so forth, but also talks about Chicago and the phenomena that Sullivan is in Chicago. The French government pay him a commission for doing all this in his trip. He takes that money and opens an art gallery with it called La Galerie de l'Art Nouveau.
First time we see that.
And that's the first time that name is mentioned.
Right.
And the Americans, of course, pick up on the French term and call it Art Nouveau. The Germans don't pick up on that name. They name the movement, Henry van de Velde and others call it Jugendstil, because the style of the youth, the new young style. So there's two names for the same thing, and they all come out of Chicago based on Louis Sullivan. And it's the auditorium building in Chicago that is the preeminent building to foster all this upheaval. You go to Barcelona today and you see fabulous stained glass. Not a bit of it is painted. You're sitting in the Palau de Musica in the great auditorium, you look
Sure.
at the ceiling, there's no paint on any of that glass. Why? Because they're doing Chicago style glass. And where that glass in Barcelona comes from isn't quite certain, but it's done in exactly the same manner as the glass that comes in the auditorium building from Kokomo, Indiana, the opalescent glass company, which was founded in 1888, the same year the auditorium building is worked on and starts. So this was their first big project. They were also selling glass to Tiffany at the time as one of their first customers in opalescent glass. So this kind of glass was brand new on the market. And Kokomo was the center of it. Kokomo is about 150 miles from Chicago. It's basically out in the middle of nowhere, but it had natural gas, which was good for the kilns. It was free, basically. And then you just brought in good sand and you could make glass. The whole European secular world, the villas, the train stations, the public buildings, City Hall, operas, theater buildings, all the lobbies, the town hall in Prague and elsewhere in Budapest, they all start using non-painted glass.
Assembled glass.
And it's assembled
like
glass,
and,
whether it's mosaic, and it's all based on what then becomes an interpretation of what Chicago exhibited in 1889 in the World's Fair in Paris.
So earlier you had mentioned abstraction of glass. Prior to what we're seeing here, like behind us and in the auditorium building, we had painted glass that were representational of natural forms, right? But that's not an abstraction like we understand today, right? Where you can't really make anything out. More of a conventionalization of nature that then kind of finds its way through the art.
Well, there's no nature in this glass. What we're seeing is sort of Celtic knots.
And a little bit of leaf
ropes
work.
and a little bit of leaf work, but it's not a specific leaf.
Right.
It's not like it's
Right.
a pin oak or something or a maple leaf which a painter would do.
Right.
And if you abstract that, then you just maybe do a rectangle, but it looks like a leaf. And it's an abstraction of a leaf. This is not really abstract.
Okay.
It's a rope motif with leaves in it, done without looking like a rope, with leaves in it.
With actual leaves.
With actual leaves.
From an actual tree.
From an actual tree.
Right.
Because nothing's painted.
So there's principles behind this of nature that was sort of like the basis of
But it's not an
Sullivan.
abstraction as such.
Okay.
Everything is an abstraction ultimately, but it's not what we think of a Kandinsky or something like that.
Right.
Or Picasso abstracting. It's not that kind.
Right.
There's always some real object behind it, but it's not about that real object that's behind it. So we have knots, we have ropes, we have jewels that are lenses that have been given facets. They look like diamonds, but they're not diamonds. They're yellow, they're blue, they're red, they're green. Cast glass can be a shape of an ice cube with a little point on it, or you can chip the glass by hitting it with a mallet, and it chips and fractures the glass, and then you set in that fractured glass. And glass is an extremely versatile material. And in the auditorium building, you can see the early examples of what America does with that glass. And then when it gets to Europe, the Art Nouveau artisans, architects, designers, take it to other levels. But it starts here.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about the role that this building played in the use of glass in secular buildings, right? Because it used to be, it started out as religious and possibly like very wealthy residential.
It was residential. Castles had stained glass, but they were different. Chapels always had stained glass in them, but it's always an expensive product until the 19th century when it starts being mass produced, which reduces the cost. And you can make giddy, gaudy glass, or you can make really high quality, good quality glass, and then it's the artisan that cuts it up and makes it into a religious window, if he paints on it, or a secular window if he doesn't. And all civic buildings that wanted to be up to date in the 1890s, 1900 time period, and there was an enormous amount of wealth in Europe and in the United States generated that time, which allowed a lot of building to happen. They go for the secular glass. The secular world doesn't paint its glass.
Right. It assembles colored glass.
It assembles colored glass.
Textures.
So that we see it in Budapest, for example, at the Franz Liszt Music Academy, the Auditorium Concept. We see this building from the outside and it doesn't look like the Paris Opera. The Paris Opera is an opera, obviously.
Singularly.
It's singular, it's an opera, and it's all about opera-ness.
Right.
And that's its function.
Nice.
You look at the auditorium building, and it had a bar in it, it had a hotel in it, it had offices in it, and in the middle is a 4,000-seat theater. And it's got all this new decoration in it. And the Europeans hadn't seen anything like that. If you want a theater, you build a theater, and it looks like a theater. This does not look like a theater. It looks like a commercial building from the outside. It functions like a commercial building, except that it has a great theater in it with perfect acoustics.
Right.
And the Franz Liszt Music Academy in Budapest takes that about 15 years after this building and builds that kind of building. In Prague, you have the same thing in the municipal building.
Right.
All sorts of stained glass. Alphonse Mucha decorates it. But there's the Bartók Hall. It's inside the building.
Right.
And you don't notice it from the outside.
Right.
And that's a new convention that comes from Chicago.
The significance of this building,
Of
the
this
auditorium
specific building.
Right.
And that we're in it.
Right.
And you can see it in Chicago first.
Right.
And electric lights, this was something that was not used in European buildings in 1888.
Right. So touching on the electric light, the auditorium building is one of the first commercially electrified buildings, and there's plenty of glass in the building that doesn't have natural daylight. So can you talk a little bit about this idea of like you had a specific tone, an Edison bulb,
Well, the Edison bulb is not a clear white bulb. That doesn't get introduced until a couple decades later. But the 1880s bulb is much more like a candle light. It's yellowish in tone. And the bamboo filament, the carbon bamboo filament, gives off a tannish tone. which is the same light that you get from a gas light, which is the same light you get from a candlelight.
Right.
And that's what our eyes have been used to for millennia.
So in many ways, the glass
fire.
colors were selected with that light in mind?
The glass colors were selected, exactly.
Okay.
Precisely. The glass colors have amberness to them generally. They're not giddy. They're not bright colors. That comes a little later. And it has a different function. But you can illuminate these windows and put windows in spaces where you couldn't put a gas light behind it because it burns and it's a fire. But you can put an Edison bulb behind it. And it then just glows.
Right, in the way they intended.
And that's part of the intention that also happens in this building. And that sets up a whole new way of looking at windows. You don't need sunlight, you don't need flame, you can use electricity, the new kid on the block. And again, it's American. It's not a European thing to do that. So we're sitting in this auditorium building with stained glass that's highly original in texture, pattern, look, but also technology.
So Rolf, as we've discussed, there's a plenitude of glass in the building here, and the majority of it is this mosaic glass, right? These sort of patterns that are put together in color, but we do have some figural representations in the lobby, and those you're mainly seeing as you enter. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing in those lunettes?
As you enter, you see there's a series of lunettes. They're semicircles. They sort of look like protractors, but they're figures, and they are muses for the various art forms that take place in the auditorium. And those muses hold various instruments, like a book represents reading or theater. A flute represents music and concerts. We have a variety of those, and those are also by Healy and Millay, a company that, sad to say, we know very little about because by 1900 they were gone. They were a Chicago company. Healy and Millay had met and got together, formed a partnership for decorative arts, and they did interiors. But all of their records, everything, all their documentation is gone. All we have is the windows that we know of by them. And as opposed, in the 19th century, not all artists always signed their windows. I mean, Tiffany was very conscientious and always put his name on the windows, but others didn't, which was the medieval tradition, and Healy and Millay did not put their names on windows. And sometimes in church records, you'll find, oh, our windows were by Healy and Millay. And you say, well, all of them or just some of them? Or, we don't know. Right. And we know that the windows here in the auditorium building were done by Healy and Millay. That's what the records indicate. Not Healy and Millay's records, but the auditorium building's records, which of course was only about the auditorium. And so we don't know enough about Healy and Millay at all.
Or their artisans,
or
right?
Their
because
artisans.
They were there.
We have no idea who worked for them. You could go through all the Chicago directories and read them like a telephone book, because there would be the name of a person, and then it says stained glass artist or glass cutter.
Listed their profession.
It lists their profession.
Okay.
But with the city directories of 800 pages, it takes you a while to read every single column and look at every single glass cutter, and then you still don't know where they worked. Right. You just know there was a glass cutter.
It's a sad fact of buildings of this era where there's so much beauty and art put into it, and we know where those initial concepts came from, and sometimes the specific designs, but where it translates down the line, where the hands go into the plaster, where the hands go on the glass.
Who actually makes the design, who makes the reality of the design, that we don't know.
That's one of the things I love about this building in particular, is that the people who built it were creating all of this beautiful work and didn't need their name attached to it. It was going to be put here for generations. Right.
The 20th century, 21st century that we're in, is all about ego.
Right.
If it doesn't have my name attached to it, why am I doing it?
It has value because of the name, not because of what it is.
Exactly.
Right. But this is the opposite.
So the name gets bigger and bigger and bigger, which increases the value more and more and more. It used to be that you bought something because of the aesthetic. We don't do that.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because here's one of the rare examples where you can see a lot of this glass in situ. It's still in the building.
It's still in the building, not in the museum.
Right. Whereas a lot of other buildings, sadly, have had their pieces, their art, their beauty, go to a museum as an artifact instead of a living piece of
We see a nice elevator grill designed by Jenny or something, but it's in Boston in a museum. We see this window behind us. You also see it in the auditorium here, but you can also see one in the Art Institute.
Right.
Most of our art objects that were in secular buildings are now in museums, whether it's Boston, San Francisco, the Art Institute in Chicago, or the Louvre in Paris.
And I think that speaks to the quality and the talent and the beauty of these elements, that they were made for pennies on the dollar, and now they're bought and sold and auctioned and hung in world famous museums as
What's
examples.
really interesting about that is that you see a lot of Chicago stuff in museums. You do not see New York stuff in museums in the same way. And it's not that New York saved all of its buildings. It just wasn't that in the forefront of the decorative arts and interior design in the 1880s, 90s. As Chicago was. Chicago was the leader, and everybody else copies what happens in Chicago. It's innovative, and it's that innovation that everybody in the world looked at. When they built their first skyscrapers in Shanghai, for example, where did they go? They didn't go to New York to see how the foundation should be laid, because Shanghai was a city built on mud.
Like Chicago.
They came to Chicago in the 1930s, and they put up their first skyscraper based on the Chicago model, not a New York model.
Yeah, as exemplified, I think, by this building, as you've mentioned, right? Because
this is where it all gets kick-started.
Such a large, massive building for the time, predating
everything, basically. I mean, it's not the skyscraper, but it's contemporaneous to the skyscraper. It's massive, it's enormous, and it has all these art elements on the inside, and an auditorium that's hidden away. And that's what the world was fascinated by, and it still continues that way.
Right.
Chicago is really the center of innovation and inventiveness that you can't see anywhere else. I mean, you could stand at Quincy and LaSalle Street, right next to the Rookery. You can see that what was the world's tallest building in 1886, 11 stories, look west and see the Sears Tower, or the Willis Tower now, which was the world's tallest building for 17 or 18 years.
Right.
And those two buildings are only 80 years apart.
Right. In the same city.
In the same city.
Right.
You can't do that anywhere else in the world.
On essentially bogland.
Yeah, it's a swamp.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all the building wants to do is sort of fall over, but it's not.
Right.
Because of clever foundation construction and innovative foundations.
Right.
The auditorium building is, just by its very nature and the year that it was built in and designed, it was designed very rapidly, it was built very rapidly, and it changed the world of architecture rapidly, because it feeds right into Art Nouveau. Chicago is in the forefront on a whole variety and different layers, including with Healy and Millet's ideas, with Louis Sullivan's ideas of how to build a building, what to put in a building, what sells a building. He didn't make any money on any of this, but geniuses often don't. Except today, they all make money.
Well, Rolf, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for lending your knowledge and expertise to us for a while here on the glass in the auditorium building and the role that it's played in the sort of world scene at the time and continues to do so. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for letting me talk and rattle on about the world's greatest building.
Could go on for hours. We love it. Yeah, it's fantastic.
It.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What an amazing episode. And I hope you're inspired to seek out the stained glass in the Auditorium Theater next time you're here for a performance. Thank you to our moderator, Matt McNicholas, and stained glass expert and architectural historian, Rolf Achilles. Special thanks to our virtual tour series sponsor, the Ephraimson Family Fund. Thank you for joining us, and please visit our website at auditoriumtheatre.org for more information on in-person tours and upcoming shows. Thank you.